Okay, folks, we'll get started. My name is Doug Kellner, and I serve as co-chair of the New York State Board of Elections. I'm just one of 4 commissioners, so I often say that when I speak about policy issues, it's like hearing one hand clapping. And so to start off our panel on our discussion, I want to just briefly outline some of the issues in New York to start the discussion. In New York, we have 4 basic computer systems that the state election authorities are responsible for. Most significant is the voting system itself, where we certify the voting machines. The second is that we maintain the statewide voter registration database. The third is the election night reporting system, which by far is the most vulnerable of our systems. And then last is the campaign finance disclosure system, which unfortunately in New York we say is old enough to vote and is using technology that's probably 3 generations too old. Budget issues keep stopping us from finishing an update to the system to something that's only 1 generation old. On the voting system itself, I think we're fairly proud because New York in 2005 was able to implement at what at the time was the full verified voting agenda in setting up its system. And we always said that we were the last to comply with HAVA, but we at least claim that we were the first to get it right. So the New York system bans hooking up the system to the internet or wireless communications with any of the scanners that count votes. But we go one step further and we require that the entire election management system be isolated from the internet, which is a burden, but we're very tough in enforcement on that on the counties. And if a county does put non-certified software into their election management system computer, we make them re-enter the certified software not only on the election management system but on each and every machine. And in the one county where that happened, that was quite a burden for the county and a lesson that everybody else learned, that it's important that they keep their system insulated. Of course, we have a certification process, and our certification process includes a review of the source code and escrow of the source code used in the voting systems. And we also go a step further there, that not only do we have the accredited testing laboratory, but we have an independent review of the accrediting testing laboratory. And in 2008, that became pretty significant because our independent review of the testing laboratory revealed that of about 3,000 criteria that were required to be tested, only 1,000 were included within the test plans, and it led the U.S. Election Assistance Commission to discredit that laboratory cyber, which of course was part of the problem in delaying New York's implementation of the system. And then New York also, I think, is the only state in the country where we prohibit the county election officials from contracting out the job of ballot configuration, that we require that county election officials do the election management system setup for the system. And that is a burden on some of the smaller counties, and we have worked out backup systems and sharing systems so that they can do that. But at least everybody who touches the actual voting system is a sworn public official. And then finally, we have a random 3% audit, which, as I say, was state-of-the-art at the time. So far, we haven't been able to get the necessary consensus to switch to a risk-limiting audit. With the other systems, just quickly say that we have been working very closely with the Department of Homeland Security and with comparable agencies in New York State government to identify risk threat assessments, and there have been risk threat assessments down to the county level. One of the things that we have encountered, which has been referred to by others so far, is that especially in the smaller counties, the election management system, which includes the portal to our closed network for the voter registration database, is part of the county system, and these counties have very minimal cyber protection in place, and that with a lot of our HAVA money, we've been using it to bolster these county systems, which benefit not just the Board of Elections, but all of the other county agencies that are using that same computer system. So there is a real synergy by getting these counties to pay attention to cyber threats. And as I say, both the Department of Homeland Security and the New York State Police and other New York State agencies dealing with cybersecurity have been very helpful in identifying that county issue. But we wish we would be even more successful in getting the funding necessary to do everything to remediate these risk threats that we've identified. And then finally, election night reporting is perhaps the trickiest, because inherently there's no way to do election night reporting without putting it over the internet, and so you have denial of service threats, and you have the threat of hacking. We're aware of it. We do as much as we can to prevent it, and that election night reporting system is completely separate from the official vote counting system, which is still done basically by sneakerware, that the counties have to certify their own results, and the counties have to basically hand deliver those results to the State Board of Elections. So the official results are pretty well protected, but there are serious problems that we've talked about that can happen if we fail with election night reporting. So that's my quick summary. To turn to our next panelist, Matt Masterson started out certifying voting machines for the Ohio Secretary of State, and then he became a commissioner at the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, where he was just great in working with state election officials and local election officials in doing all the fine things that the Election Assistance Commission did at a time when the commission was under attack in Congress and by some state election officials, and I thought Matt negotiated that in a brilliant way. And now Matt is senior cybersecurity advisor at the Department of Homeland Security, where he's bringing all of that background to a new level, and we really appreciate him joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll probably stay here because I think the way we're going to do this is just short opening remarks and then questions from both Doug and the panel. And I want to thank EVN. This is, I don't know how many years I've come. I missed last year. Apologies for that. But I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to work with all of you. And the theme of this panel is obviously partnership. And it's not lost on me the irony that someone from the Department of Homeland Security would be on the partnership panel. So I'm not sure if I'm supposed to talk about the lessons learned or the progress made. As many of you know, and I think Suzanne probably at least referenced a little bit earlier today, our former colleague at DHS, the relationship with state and local officials was rocky, to say the least. When DHS in January 2017 declared election systems as part of our nation's critical infrastructure. It happened quickly. The election officials, I think rightfully, wanted to understand, what does this mean? What is your role? How will this work? What does this empower or not empower DHS to do? And in the end, how does this help us, right? In the end, it's about what support, what value does this bring to us? So I was at the EAC at the time. I was the chairman at the time, and we were fortunate. DHS was willing to partner with us, work with us to help bridge that education gap and talk through it. So we, in 2018, jumped over to DHS to begin to work on building out the election sector, to begin to build out the tools, support, information sharing necessary to support our mission for election officials. And our mission is to make sure that election officials and their private sector partners and others who support them have access to the necessary information and intelligence they need to manage risks to their systems, right? In the end, our goal isn't obviously to run the systems. They are the systems owners, operators. They understand what's needed. Our goal is to provide them the information they need to understand risks to the systems, mitigate those risks, and in the end run the process. And as I think the EAC touched on during their presentation, this in the midst of that being one of a bajillion jobs election officials have, right? They're not just spending their time securing systems. They're doing so many other things, both elections related, but I mean, the example I always use is an election official in Missouri telling me she was in charge of the water table. And I'm thinking, I don't even know what that means. Like, that for me, that's my 5-year-old or 6-year-old splashing around at a table, right? But that's one of the many jobs many of these local election officials have. So how do we empower them to understand risks to their systems and manage that risk, and be able to implement basic cyber hygiene practices and information sharing to manage that? So throughout 2018, that's what we worked to do. The first thing we did was stand up the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, easy for me to say, EISAC. I'll try to stay away from federal acronyms, which is the hub of information sharing for state and local election officials with the federal government. It's the place that we share information down to them. They share information back to us so that we can have a global understanding of general activity and risks threatening the election infrastructure and pushing information down. We started that in February, March 2018. By Election Day 2018, all 50 states and over 1,400 jurisdictions are participating in the EISAC, which is a remarkable growth, the fastest growing ISAC we have in critical infrastructure, and really a real credit to the election officials. They were skeptical. They weren't sure what value we had to bring to this process, but they knew that they wanted information. Right? And so starting with that information sharing, I think, allowed us to begin to build that trust, those trusted relationships, in order to help support them. The second leg to our stool was providing support and services to them. So DHS offers a number of services to local and state election officials to help them understand and manage risk. Everything from remote cyber hygiene scans, which is just scanning the outward-facing networks and websites, providing weekly reports to them on known vulnerabilities that they can fix, and re-upping those if they don't fix them over time. We also do phishing campaign assessments, which we found incredibly successful with particular county successful. I didn't mean it that way, but I mean, yeah, kind of. Where over 12 weeks we test the organization's ability to spot, identify phishing, and I will say our teams at DHS take a great deal of pride in creating increasingly more complex phishing campaigns. They really love getting people to click or open links or otherwise, and I think Trevor could speak to that. They'll go dig around on you a little bit to really push you and your organization. We also do on-site risk and vulnerability assessment, which is penetration testing of the systems that the officials would like us to look at, and we actually offer a new remote penetration testing assessment that was built based on feedback from election officials who said, this is of great value to us, we're getting value from the service, we'd like something that is more scalable, that doesn't require a team to come on site for 2 weeks, right? That can be disruptive to the process. How can you help us? And so we were able to build that out, and we'll continue to push. The final leg of our partnership stool or trust stool was the intelligence and information sharing. So the ability to get state-level clearances out to the secretaries of state and their designees to be able to push intelligence information. One of the big lessons learned, I think, from 2016, 2017 is they felt like they didn't have access to the information they really needed to understand what was going on. And so we actively pushed clearances out to the state and local officials. We held secret level briefings with one-day read-ins for folks as well, so that folks can have the access to the information they need to manage risk to the systems. So that's kind of 2018, and I can't underscore the significance of the fact that all 50 states were willing to work with us in some way. We literally went from states accusing us of targeting them or hacking them or attempting to hack them, right, to working with us and robustly sharing information. The amount of information that state and local officials shared with us, either through the EI ISAC or through the Albert sensors that are deployed on the vast majority of states' election infrastructure, was immense. And we now have a much better understanding of the type of traffic and activity targeting election infrastructure, all because election officials were willing to work with us and trust us in that way. So moving forward, just quickly, our priorities are, we've got the states on board now, right? We're working with them. We're continuing to build those trusted relationships. How do we build out the relationships with those mid to small counties? How do we reach, through our last mile project or other efforts, those mid to small counties that have little to no time, little to no resources, and really help them build out their understanding of risk and working with their private sector partners who are so integral to the work that they do, right? And then how do we mature the risk discussion around election infrastructure to inform those who make budgetary decisions about elections, county commissioners, state legislators, others, to help them understand what it means to meaningfully invest in election infrastructure. What is meaningful investment in securing election infrastructure? What is the ongoing cost of doing that, and what risks do we buy down when we invest in, for instance, cyber navigators for county officials? What are the risks we're buying down by doing that, and justifying those investments? So we're spending time working with both our county and state election official partners and their private sector folks to really understand that risk. So finally, I just wanted to touch on, because I think for this group, it's a good item, touching on the characteristics of those partnerships. How did we go from complete distrust, right, literally viewing us as a malicious actor, literally, right, to a trusted relationship? And the first starts with providing value, providing support. Election officials work in a resource-starved environment, right? They have not just lack of resources and money, they have lack of resource and access to skilled technical people, right? And they have lack of access to time. They cannot get time back. The time they spend on one thing is time they can't get back to spend on another, right? And so if we can offer value in either providing that IT knowledge, that cybersecurity knowledge, saving them time or saving them money, that's tangible value that's brought to bear to help support them. Second is empathy. Something the federal government's not particularly good at, right? But going out and meeting them where they are. I spend a lot of my time on the road. Our folks, our regional folks out in the field, our cybersecurity advisors, protective security advisors, and regional directors spend a lot of time in the offices of state and local election officials, understanding their environment, understanding their needs, building that empathetic relationship in the states. Because as all of you hear all the time, no state runs elections exactly the same way, and understanding those dependencies and needs is critical. So having that shared empathy. And then finally, the shared mission space, which we found to be the easiest bridge to gap. State election officials, local election officials are committed to securing democracy. They want to do it. And so do we. We view it as a national security issue, right? Securing our democracy is critical to our national security. And so that shared mission, that shared understanding is the bridge that allows us to provide that value and support them. So since it was about partnership, and I'll end on this. Many in this room have gone and built those trusted relationships. I think of Pam Smith, the first time she pulled me in to meetings like that. And she listened, and she talked through the challenges and built empathy with me and understood my challenges and her needs. All of us should model that kind of behavior. Folks like Mark Lindeman and Neil McBurnett that go out to the local election offices, talk to them, understand their system dependencies, right? Those are real relationships that are built. And honestly, it's a lot harder to look someone in the eye and say no thank you to support or service because election officials will take it because they know they need it. But you got to meet them where they are. And I applaud those in this room that have gone and done that. Thank you. As an election official, thank you for doing that.
Thanks, Matt. That was great. You got so much in there.
Sorry, I talked
so
fast.
No, you did great. Next, I introduce Maurice Turner, who's a technologist, cybersecurity policy expert who works with the Center for Democracy and Technology. And Maurice, why don't you tell us what you're up to?
Sure thing. Thank you. I appreciate everyone staying awake for this last panel. We're going to have a good one. I really appreciate it. So again, my name is Maurice Turner. I am Senior Technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're based in D.C. The center's been around for 25 years now, working on broader internet issues, but just in the last 2 years, we've been focused on election security, and that's really been where I've been putting my energy, making sure that the information that's out there about cybersecurity makes its way through a bit of a translation, but gets out to not only local officials, but also state officials and federal officials as well. So I'm going to go over the big partnerships that we've been able to form over the past year. First, going out to the states. So CDT partnered with the National Conference of State Legislators, NCSL, to go out and actually help educate state legislators and their staffers on the cybersecurity risks that election systems face. The idea there was to get them familiar with some of the terms, the new acronyms that they would be hearing about coming out of the federal level, but most importantly, help prep them for the requests that are coming up for budget dollars from the local officials. All of this that we're talking about is meaningless if the state legislators don't recognize that this is an actual budget priority and begin to think of it not as a one-time opportunity to look for funding from the federal level, but more of a long-term strategy. So thinking about it as infrastructure, truly as infrastructure, which is kind of a scary thing to say considering the state of some of the roads and bridges we have in the country, but that's a topic for a different conference. But this idea that it's going to take more than just one-time funding from the federal government about every decade or so to try to solve this. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to be programmatic. It needs to be expected, who is going to chip in at which level in order to make it all happen. So that, I believe, was a great success. We were able to go to 4 different cities and actually touch legislators or their staffers who came from more than half of the country. And so looking forward to filling in some of those gaps at future events. Secondly, there was outreach directly to local election officials, and that was through a partnership with the Center for Technology and Civic Life, CTCL. So they're experts in, I saw you trying to spell it out there, CTCL, CDT, working together on cybersecurity.
You're worse than me.
So they're really experts at getting the curriculum down to the point where people can log on to a webinar series and feel like they have an interactive process where they can feel comfortable not only getting new information, but comfortable asking questions, some questions that might be embarrassing to ask out in public, or questions that you just might not think anyone else wants to hear the answer to, but it turns out they do want to hear the answer to it. So the idea was to have an online webinar series where the focus was simply on the basics of cybersecurity, run through some scenarios, all with this idea of how do you make it relevant to local election officials. What we're talking about is not new, but what is new is to make it relevant to the local election officials. So one, that they buy into the fact that these are risks that they will be facing if they have not already been facing them. But two, get those officials comfortable to the point where they want to go up and ask for particular tools, particular services that they may not have in-house, but they need the money for. Again, tying it back to the state level partnerships. The last partnership that I find truly, truly valuable is getting out to the security researchers that I believe are in every single community across the country. We hear time and time again that there are not enough cybersecurity workforce. There's not enough cybersecurity workforce out there, but I think that there really is enough interest and talent that if a couple of those folks with the technical background can be identified in area of jurisdiction, you only need to get 1 or 2 of them to come volunteer on election day. get them hooked into this world that we're hooked into, and show them that there is a real need for particular skills that they have. One of the ways we did that was actually going out to some of these hacker conferences, so things like B-Sides in Las Vegas, like DEF CON that we heard about earlier, going out to where the security researchers actually are in the same way that I like to go out to the local jurisdictions where the officials are and meet them and explain this is the need that we have, and there is a way that you can get involved in your local community. So I think by bridging the gaps between state legislators, local officials, and local security researchers, we can fill in some of these gaps that we have when it comes to how do we make our election systems more secure, more resilient. And I really look forward to talking more about and hearing about more ways that you think we might be able to encourage security researchers to get involved. And I believe a great example of that is throwing out words like DARPA, prototype, and DEF CON. Oh my gosh, that is going to be the ultimate honeypot for getting people excited to come out and get involved. So we really should take advantage of these kinds of opportunities to get more people into this community.
Oh, thank you, Maurice. So last but not least, we'll introduce Monica Childers, who describes herself as an election tech nerd, but is an expert on collaborative design and talks about building low-cost and open source solutions. So Monica would be very interested in how what kinds of partnerships you've been able to work on.
Thanks so much, and thank you, EVN, for having me. So for the past 8 months, I've been serving as the Colorado project manager for their risk limiting audit tool, which is the open source production level software that they've been developing with partners to help facilitate their risk limiting audits, which they do as a standard statewide measure for 2 years now. And it's been a real learning experience, so I just want to tell you a little bit about what I've learned coming from a software and a tech background, a nonprofit one and an election nerd one, but still coming at it from a slightly different perspective than either an advocate or an election security expert or a government entity. So one of the things that I think has been really important in Colorado and is a credit to so many of you in this room, Neil McBarnett, you've been mentioned so many times, but it's because it's deserved, and Ron Rivest and Philip Stark and Mark Lindeman, so many experts were willing to go into Colorado and say, here's what we think you should do. But there was a real recognition that there were going to be different goals and value was going to be different for an election administrator than it was necessarily for this community or for the advocacy community. So it's been interesting to me to watch election administrators at these RLA pilots around the country, because some of the things that election administrators find most fascinating about RLAs are actually some of the things that the process reveals that don't actually contribute to verifying the election. They're just sort of freebies. So for example, when you find a particularly creative way that a voter has marked a ballot that was adjudicated one way on election night, and when it's re-adjudicated in the audit process is adjudicated differently, that's an example of something that comes up that's a total side benefit. That's not what the audit is supposed to catch, but if you're doing a ballot comparison audit, those kinds of things come to light. Also strange things that your scanner might have missed, or places where your process of stacking and scanning ballots is getting your poll workers confused, things like that. They love that stuff. For an election administrator, finding those little process improvements along the way is really powerful. And so yes, they care about verifying the election outcome, but that's a really powerful motivator to say, this is going to help you tighten up your process. Brenda talked about this a lot from the audit in Fairfax, which they found ways to tighten up their paper process, having to go through building a ballot manifest and knowing where all the boxes were and knowing how to get to every ballot. That really forces you to do things. And so the broad point that I want to make is it was interesting to me that election administrators could still find different values that perhaps were not the ones that you had originally targeted. And being open to that and being able to recognize and say, that's great. What value are you finding in this? What things are you able to come away with that maybe were not the goals that you originally had? The second thing that I want to bring up is this idea of perfection. I think we would like there to be perfect elections. I know that would be wonderful. I would like that. They don't exist. That's not real. We don't live in that world. And we all know this instinctively, but I think it's really hard to kind of grapple with on a real level that ballots are going to be miscounted in every election. Something's going to get lost. Some process is going to not work. A poll worker is not going to show up. This stuff is just, we're human beings. This is a human process. It's run by people, and we're going to make it the best that we can, but at the same time, stuff is always going to happen. And election administrators, I have seen them live with that reality day to day and build contingency plans and backups and plan A through G because your contingency might fail too. So they're really well aware of that, and they do a really good job managing what I think for me might create a ton of anxiety to grapple with on a daily basis. But one of the things that we can do as a community to help them is to come in with that recognition front and center and say, we're not asking you to do the perfect thing yet if you can't. Here's a good option. Here's a better option. Here's a best option. And as Colorado found out, we may not get to that better option. I don't even think Colorado would say they're the best option. I don't know, Trevor, what do you think? Yet, you may not get to that for 10 years. It may take a long time. We want instantaneous results. We want perfection. It's great to strive for, but keeping that realization that better is still progress, right? We should applaud every little piece of progress. We should applaud every little gain that we can get because we need all of them, right? This is a big project with a lot of work. And the other thing, I just want to sort of echo what Matt said about empathy, and Neil, I will call you out again. One of the things I have loved about watching Neil McBurnett work is he comes in and just says, oh, that's interesting. Huh, what can we do about that? And it's this very welcoming way of approaching the world that makes election administrators feel safe. There is nothing scarier than trying something new, right? That's true for all of us. That's just a human thing. But it is particularly true in a high-stress, high-stakes job like elections where cybersecurity is relatively new to a lot of local election officials. This is a big, new, scary world. So being able to just be a safe space for them and make it so that they can ask questions and fail. The thing we always say in all of the RLA pilots, which I love, is it's a pilot. It's a pilot. That means things are going to go wrong. And so approaching all of these cybersecurity improvements as if it's a pilot is a really wonderful, I think, lesson to take away because it has made so many jurisdictions feel comfortable to dip their toes and just try it and find out that it's maybe not so scary after all. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Monica. All right, so let's wrap up with a discussion of what people think in terms of adding additional partnerships or where we really need additional resources. Sure. John McCarthy.
I'm finally learning you have to jump up fast because then beat the rush. This may be one of those hard questions you aren't really supposed to ask. But I think that verified voting was one of the original partners in developing the online computer system that supports the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and other people who work on election day to keep track of problems that occur all over the United States. And it's a great resource for identifying problems. What kinds of problems? Where do they occur? But we've had that first year, I think, because we were part of the people who built it, a lot of that data was shared. Subsequently, other people did the software, and we've gotten very little response when we ask for that data. I don't know, are there any Lawyers Committee people here today? I really think we need to somehow figure out how to reach out to them, because that data could be very helpful. It could be helpful in lawsuits, could be helpful in understanding which equipment is failing and all kinds of stuff like that. Anybody care to comment?
Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I'll share at least an anecdote, and that is that the folks, and I'm going to butcher the exact name, but the folks from the voter protection something Pam Smith was helping lead were actually part of our operations center on election day at DHS. Yeah. And so we found a great deal of value in their ability, their reach out into the field and understanding what was happening out on election day, the reports, running down fact from fiction. They were super valuable in being able to do that and work through some of those issues. So to the extent that that was an incredible partnership that we're very thankful that they were willing to work with us on election day in coordination with, by the way, the political parties, NASA, NASAD, some of the private sector partners, all in one place on election day, run that down in coordination with our cyber situational awareness room, which had over 600 state and local election officials, federal partners in it, all at the same time sharing information. And I think Trevor and folks like that were in that room would tell you the value in being able to share information real time like that on election day and track that down was huge. So that was a quasi answer, I guess.
And I think a lot of election officials do keep track of their problems and try to learn from them. Maybe if some of our local election officials are willing to comment on that. Dana, for example, you track your problems, right?
We're allowed to call on people?
Can I just chime in really quick? So one of the things, and this has been something we've seen in Colorado with the RLA, is that a lot of interested parties really want the data immediately so they can rerun the RLA. And the code is open source, but the data that feeds it it has to come from the state. The state has to publish it. And so we're working on making that more accessible in real time where we can. And that will be a part of the tool going forward. But I will also say it has been hard sometimes because timing can be an issue when you're asking for things like data, recognizing that there are lots of things going on after the election that still have to be done. And if it's not an urgent thing that you get the data on election day or the day after election day, maybe being able to wait and give people some breathing room, but also explaining what you want it for. So everybody's afraid that you're going to sue them with the data. Literally everybody. That is the reticence, is this is going to come back and bite me in a lawsuit or a news story or whatever. And so if you have that trusted relationship and you can build an understanding with your local election officials about what you want the data for, how it's going to be used, some places will say, that's fine, but will you share your results with us? And will you sign a confidentiality agreement? Like, you don't always have to do that, but there are options out there for getting data in a way until you can build that trust that people know what you're going to use it for and are willing to give it up more freely.
Sure.
I already have the mic. I'm sorry.
Oh, all right. Susan will be next.
I am a freelance reporter that got into this game in Georgia during the midterms, so I'm swimming in the deep end, and I may be stretching the idea of partnership here, but I wonder in terms of public education and communication if there's any idea of partnership or education with especially local media, because I imagine that everyone in this room who has any kind of understanding has been frustrated with local regional reporting and getting things very wrong.
Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, that's apparently me. Yeah, turn to DHS for media partnership. The answer is yes. So absolutely, we actually worked and talked with ProPublica quite a bit in the lead up to the election because of their reach out into local reporting. And we conducted a media tabletop exercise in the lead up to the election with some of the DC-based national media to work through what to expect on election day, what's the communication channels, how will information be shared, all of that, all in an effort to try to build common understanding like that. But I think there's a lot more. All of us, certainly and I think some folks in this room have done an unbelievable job reaching out to the media and really kind of off the record, behind the scenes, just educating on local election processes, systems, things like that. But I think there's a lot more we can do to have an understanding, even of just the systems involved, right? And how to use the correct or more accurate jargon or technical language around each system. That a voter registration system is not a voting system, is not a election night reporting system, right? Those things matter as we talk about risk and threat to the system.
Great. Susan Lerner? Okay.
Well, in that case, I'll
Okay.
go ahead and I'll add to that.
I'm sorry, Maurice. Go ahead.
So I think, media is incredibly important as a partnership avenue. And as Matt was saying, language matters. So I think having the media be more educated leads to a more educated public. If we're going to talk about these kinds of attacks that we're seeing, not everything can be a hack. We need to be more specific about what's going on. We need to talk about scans and probes and breaches and exfiltration of data so we can have a more sophisticated conversation. Because if we just go around saying, I've been hacked, that doesn't cut it. We do need to have that more sophisticated conversation. And CDT has always been open and available on the record, off the record, to any media that's interested. And I think that, very specifically using Twitter as a conduit to specifically reach local media and national media and international media for that matter is an important way that local officials can actually get out there. That's why as part of the training that we offer, we emphasize actually getting out onto social media platforms as a way to connect with voters, connect with the media. But to do so safely. And so that means that, if an official is going to be on Twitter or on Facebook, they need to make sure they're using two-factor authentication, use those additional tools that are available from a security standpoint to make sure that no one, as Josh had pointed out, is impersonating you online, to make sure that you're connecting as securely as possible, and to be where the voters and the media are actually getting the information. It doesn't do any good to have a press release that goes out into a website if the conversation is happening on a Facebook page. And so it's like going out and making sure to be able to meet people where they are gathering. And I think that it's important to recognize that media is gathering on Twitter. It's basically the API for information. That is where a lot of information is being pulled from. And more importantly, I think that is a way to be part of the conversation. And so as much as I can, I advocate that, getting on social media is very important for officials to be able to have that two-way conversation.
So I'm glad you asked that. No, but because you'd have to publish like 8,800 of them. But there is a glossary of election cyber terminology that's available on our DHS website. We worked with EAC and the IC on that, and so we can make sure folks have it. But it at least helps to do what Maurice just described, which is provide better clarity and definition to the various cyber terms being used in the election space, which is so important to have that accuracy, especially in an environment where we're talking about attempts to undermine confidence in the process, right? Reporters want to be accurate and factual behind it, and anything we can do to help provide you that information, I think is important.
I'll just plug one more resource really quick. I'm sorry, Brenda. 2 seconds. The Democracy Fund and Tammy Patrick specifically, their Public Square program has worked a lot on this. And I believe there is a free pointer webinar, don't quote me on that, that's open to all journalists that is just sort of a primer about what are elections, what does the calendar look like, who do you call if you have a question about X, is it the state, is it the local, et cetera. So that's a pretty good resource too.
Now.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Sorry, Brenda.
Thank you, Mark.
That's okay. That's all right. We do feel like sometimes we're at the bottom of the communication food chain. I've had so many great collaborations with many of you in this room, and I love collaboration. I didn't know most of you existed a year ago, and so as a local election official, I wonder, one, what your strategies are for reaching out to really the local election officials who can only impact certain things. Even when you talk about how to create a great website, I don't have control over much of my local website except for content. So that's one thing. And then secondly, the language. When you're talking to election officials who want to lock things down and keep things secure, and then you talk about open source, common data, open data, reviewable test code, Those don't sound good to me. Blockchain does sound good to me. That sounds really strong, right? Right. So, but that's my question is, do you have a strategy for communicating this? I had a strategy. I contacted my 30-year-old son and asked him. So what is your strategy for those two things?
Really good question.
Sure. So the strategy is to find someone who is a technologist. That's all I do all day is translate, right? I translate between the folks who are deep on the science stuff, between the folks that are deep on the policy stuff, and try to find some common terminology to get everyone to understand sort of, okay, well, if you heard that blockchain is a really good thing, here is some other information that might have you change your mind. But if you hear that open source is a really scary thing, well, here are some ways that it can actually be helpful to actually provide additional levels of transparency. And I think in order to get that message out, it really does require getting in a plane and flying to go meet local election officials. There's no way around it. I've never flown so much in my life as I did in the past year. But I saw the value in that because I recognize not everyone can come to conferences like this. Not everyone can come, and go get information where it's being broadcasted, but there's a certain value in having the face-to-face relationship, and so that requires going and meeting people where they are and just having a conversation and understanding what their needs are, being empathetic to those needs and the restraints, but also offering up some new information in a way that isn't intimidating, and really showing how things like open source and test suites and things of that nature can actually fit in to meet the same goal of having a safe and secure and transparent election that is accountable. And so I think that's where it really does emphasize that the term partnership. To really understand that there are some new ways to do things to make them more secure that fit into the existing concerns that you have, but also helps to show you that there are some new concerns that you should have. And so we all need to work together. We can't just do it alone. I think this conference is a perfect example of no matter how much enthusiasm and expertise you have, it is but a narrow slice, and there are more people out there who are willing and able to help, and so we need to find a way to connect them all together.
Quickly, one, thank you for your willingness to stand up and ask that. It's the perfect question for an election official to be asking in a group like this, because we are asking you to digest complex terminology in an environment where you're doing a million other things, right? And so a few thoughts. One is I've written a note to myself to get better at that, right? We need to be DHS can serve we have lots of really good products and can do a better job electionizing them to get them to you, and then using the EI-ISAC to reach now 1,400. But we have ongoing efforts like the Last Mile Project to reach all of your colleagues that we can with this type of information. So the EI-ISAC sends out basic cyber terminology, definitions, information regularly. What is a phishing campaign, right? What is open source? That would be a really good one. Actually, that's a really good one. And so we need to do a better job now. I think folks in this room will tell you that at times the federal government's not the best communicator on this stuff, right? I'll own that. And so we need to do a better job partnering with folks like Maurice and CTCL. CTCL does such an amazing job speaking to election officials in their language, translating those topics and terminology to them. And so I think that you've put a good challenge on us as we go out and do trainings, as we go out and share information through the EI-ISAC. We need to do a better job really clearly, concisely communicating. And I actually think of your question back to the auditing summit at MIT, where basically it's like, how do you define this for us? What is a risk limiting audit? And you need that 2-sentence, 3-sentence elevator speech that says, here's why this is important for you, election official, and here's how you tap into doing this, right? So we got to get better at that.
I just want to jump in and offer a really quick, the National Academy's report offers what is intended to be a very clear, expert, authoritative refutation of blockchains in elections.
Go ahead.
Me again. I appreciate you all listening too. So Matt and I did kind of get in a very short conversation, and you asked the question of what else can be done. Well, I don't know how we can tie in the academic and the scientific research into it, but where I see the real need at the local level is, as an elections official, I know this is what we need to do. These are things that we need to be concerned with. These are prioritized in our world, as well as our state officials, with the support from the DHS, the EAC, and all of you. But where I have a hard time is convincing my county board, my county budget committee, that this needs to be a priority. They, again, look at public safety, public health. That $150 million jail they want to build and form a district to run it. That's their priority right now, not my election. Elections become a priority when they're on the ballot and at 8 o'clock when they want to know results. And as long as nothing's gone hugely wrong that the press has called them about, and I'm not being critical of my county board, they have other priorities as well. But I think we need help in prioritizing this to them, because it is of critical infrastructure. It's very urgent within us. But I just don't know where to go to it. In fact, a short story, when I went to go buy new elections equipment in 16, between the primary and general election, we sold back our equipment and purchased new stuff. Didn't even get it till the end of September, so it was very close. But best decision I made. But I got no more budget authority. I got no more money in my budget to pay for that. I had to cut the position in FTE that we had put in there to accommodate automatic voter registration, because we knew we were going to have a really increasing registration from that. We did. Once we got to the second phase, we did not have the need for really for another full-time employee, because it was getting through it and then maintaining and ongoing updates. But so we found some money there. We sold back some of the product a little bit. So I had to come up with about $22,000 in additional savings out of our current authority without any more money. So those are the type of things that they weren't even willing to look anywhere to help us with that, even though we had failing, or not, our old equipment was failing. The newer stuff we sold back was just priority. Yeah. And anyway, so those are where I think we can connect together, and you've sold us. It's now getting the people that actually apportion and budget our money, that tell us what we can spend.
So I think you bring up a great point, and I'll offer one suggestion. One way that you might be able to do it, just sneak in a little bit, is start talking the language of business continuity. So thinking about those business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans that all of your jurisdictions already have, and seeing if there's a way that you might be able to get in there. From there, you can start talking about shared services. I assume that there are other county services that are being delivered on servers somewhere, and so if you're talking about, well, how can we upgrade all of those services by perhaps getting some new equipment or entering into a new service contract, there might be some leverage you can apply. And then from the security standpoint, I think every official, elected and otherwise, should be on notice about the importance of cybersecurity in general. So if there are other agency directors who are also interested in improving their security, you all can gang up and say, look, we need two-factor authentication everywhere, because regardless of the computer system, you can have a malicious actor get in one place and they can spread and affect other city services or other county services. So let's make sure that we're as secure as we can be across the board. So I think those are perhaps a couple of small ways we might be able to get in and show that there is additional value. And then lastly, I'll say, be prepared, have the proposal drafted, so that way, I'd say it's probably a pretty good chance there's going to be some extra money in elections this year or next year. Be ready with that proposal, so that way if there is some additional funding that comes through, even if it's through a match, be ready to tell your story confidently and say, look, if we can put X dollars in, they can be matched by Y amount, and we can get this benefit. And as Matt was talking about, really lay out that return on investment argument, so that there can be a clear path of benefit to why it makes sense to make the investment in elections right now or in services that are also related to elections.
I have very little to add. It's fantastic. The only thing I'll say is, and I think we talked about this a little bit, appropriately, the voting system, if I were to make an analogy, is the fire truck of elections, right? It's the shiny object that is tangible that folks will invest in. Having a county commissioner understand the value of two-factor authentication or investing in new servers or something is a lot harder. They can't there's no picture to be taken in front of the server or the login, right? And so helping them understand the cost of cyber incidents is also powerful. Explaining the cost to Atlanta of that ransomware attack, how many, not just election offices, but county offices are able to take a hit like that cost-wise after. And a friend of mine in Ohio used to say, if you think a good election's expensive, you should see a bad one, right? There are very real costs, not just in trust and confidence and all the things. There are very real dollar costs associated with cyber incidents, and preparation and investment on the front end will save you those costs on the back end when you don't have the time and you don't have the money to respond, right?
Just to put a number on it, as Matt was talking about, Atlanta, super expensive, millions of dollars. There was another county in Georgia recently that was reported. They got hit with ransomware. All their systems were locked down with the exception of their 911 service, which seems to be a little fishy to me, but that's probably pretty good contingency planning on their part to keep it separate. The county spent $400,000 on recovery efforts. Those failed. And then they had to pay then they decided to pay the ransom. So they paid twice for something that they could have prevented on the front end. And I guarantee you they did not have that money allocated in their budget for this year. So they had to pull it from somewhere. So it's not the idea that you're going to avoid cost, avoid spending the money. You're going to spend the money. And so there needs to be a plan for it. You can either spend the money and stay online, or you can spend the money after your services are knocked offline. But there's no getting away from that cost. So keeping that in mind is something that might be helpful.
I'll just add a really low-tech version. You mentioned people pay attention to elections when they're on the ballot, and I have seen that as well. Something that most local boards really love is something that gets them in the paper for good elections, because you guys know you don't get in the paper for good elections. You only get in the paper when something goes wrong. So getting a pilot that you can tout, we're on the cutting edge of election security, we're piloting this RLA, things like that can actually go a long way towards giving people some good feeling about something that might be a scary new process, but if they're getting lauded for it in the newspaper, then that's something that maybe they can put a feather in their cap a little bit, and that can unlock some money too. So sometimes it's just getting that first step and being willing to give them the credit for it.
Eddie Hale's Advancement Project, a national racial justice action tank, and another recommended partnership with national, local, statewide civil rights groups. I mean, I know mostly these groups focus their attention on securing access to the ballot for first-time voters, infrequent voters, and disenfranchised communities. But what we have seen recently has increased interest. The Facebook hacks that targeted groups of color, reducing confidence in the elections and creating confusion. The Houston Supreme Court decision, people are concerned about illegal purges, a rash of illegal purges, and just generally there are many opportunities to reach out to Latinx groups, African American groups, Asian Pacific American groups, and other legal and advocacy organizations that want to ensure that once they get the difficult battle of getting people on the ballot, they want to ensure that those ballots are counted as cast and can be verified. So that's another partnership I recommend.
Amen. Susan.
So, I did think better of it, but I'm pretty much going to echo what Eddie said, which is that there are public partners, and that too frequently what we see in some boards is an attitude of, well, if we say anything, we'll get sued. Well, if you don't cooperate, or you don't, then you're much more, as somebody who has had to sue the Board of Elections, then you're much more likely to get sued. In my experience, the lawsuits happen when either groups or individuals have been trying to affect some change and getting absolutely nowhere. And mostly the courts end up being our backstop. It's our last resort. We would much prefer to be working with the local election officials, and the public and those groups are actually on your side on the budget fights. And I think that we are a resource that is untapped in terms of being willing to turn out people. in discussions of the need to modernize, the need to have cybersecurity, and you get what you pay for in your election. So if you don't invest in your elections, you are going to get a not good election, and it's going to cost you much more. So there are voters on your side, and in my experience, there are some local election officials who are very welcoming, who set up advisory panels, and they tend to be in jurisdictions that have a lot of forward-thinking programs and reforms in their elections. And then there are others who basically would prefer to be in a castle behind a plexiglass, behind a moat, and so that nobody can talk to them. And those are the ones who end up being sued and in the newspapers all the time. So hopefully we can find a better medium. Do take advantage of democracy groups, of civil rights groups, and the general public who don't want to stand on long lines, who don't want to be nervous that their votes are not being counted or that it's being hacked, and really do want to help.
Susan, those are great last words to close out the academic part of our conference, and I think we're now ready to retire to our champagne toast. Thank you all.